My original plan was to tell you how the global markets, the global economy, how the Indian economy would react to the Israel Hamas conflict. What are the scenarios that investors have in mind, how they are likely to react to these scenarios. And I still want to tell you that story. But then I realized that to fully appreciate it, it is necessary to know who is interested in what in the Middle East. Because unlike Avengers movies, there isn't a clear demarcation of who are the baddies and who are the good guys. Someone's friend's friend is their enemy. Another, enemy's friend is also their enemy. Middle Eastern politics is bizarrely complicated. And so, as a prequel to the financial markets and economy video that's coming up, here's a dummy's guide to the current political situation in the Middle East. And while I'm not even going to pretend that I can cover every nuance in a handful of minutes, what I have done is tried to hammer it down to 6 key defining relationships or themes that I think will play a really important role in defining what happens next in the Israel-Hamas conflict. First and very obvious theme, the 50 shades of Arab support to Hamas versus Israel. Now, Arab nations have traditionally supported the Palestine cause as a solidarity of Muslim nations, but the unity hasn't been uniform. Among Arab countries, Iran has arguably played a more active role against Israel, giving support and training to Hamas and also running the more powerful Hezbollah, a militant and political organization in Lebanon deemed as a terrorist organization by most countries. Now, Iran has been supporting Hezbollah on the borders of Israel as a kind of deterrent for the US or any of its allies from directly attacking Iran. It's like saying, if you attack my mainland, my proxy army is going to run over Israel. Iran is also, by the way, a strategic ally of Syria, which is also very anti-Israel. And fun fact, the current dictatorial regime in Syria is run by Bashar al-Assad, who has been heavily supported by Russia in the Syrian civil war. Yes, the same Russia that is at war with Ukraine, which is also buying drones from Iran. So, if you look at the map of Israel, they're literally landlocked by enemies on most sides. Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon and Syria up north, and bordered by what I would like to call frenemies like Jordan and Egypt. But there are 2 important cracks between the seeming Arab unity, which brings us to point 2. Saudi Arabia is enemies with Iran. The Saudis see themselves as a Sunni power, while Iran sees itself as a Shia power, and Shia-Sunni frictions probably predate the Israel-Palestine conflict by hundreds of years. So, in recent times, there have been plenty of regional conflicts in the Middle East, like in Syria or in Yemen, where Saudi Arabia and Iran have essentially armed and provided support to the opposing factions, thereby essentially fighting a proxy war between themselves. In fact, the 2 countries had completely cut diplomatic ties in 2016 after protesters in Iran invaded Saudi diplomatic missions following Saudi Arabia's execution of a prominent Shia scholar. It's only recently that they're back to talking terms after China brokered a deal between the 2. Now, the third layer of complexity. Israel has been lately gradually normalizing relationships with a lot of its Arab rivals, who over time have realized that even though they publicly support Palestine, strategically they are more aligned to Israel. In fact, in 2020 and 2021, brokered by the US, Israel normalized its relationship with UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, Sudan. Israel has also normalized its relationship with its bordering countries, Egypt and Jordan. And even though Saudi Arabia isn't part of this formally, there seems to be a lot of confidence building measures happening behind the scenes. Saudi Arabia is looking to secure a US defense pact and develop its nuclear capabilities in exchange of normalizing relationships with Israel. In fact, you can imagine that Palestinians were probably feeling quite frustrated at the fact that their enemy Israel was now slowly becoming friends with their friends. Some say that the attack of Hamas was essentially a ploy to break this geopolitical play, because now it's again forced the Arab nations particularly Saudi Arabia, to side against Israel and makes it politically difficult for them to arrive at an understanding, even if it is in their interest. Fourth, let's get the Americans in, which, just by the history of the world, tends to create more problems than it solves. Okay, so basics. The US obviously supports Israel unequivocally. There's a large domestic lobby in the US that would like to see this relationship protected at all costs. The US has also historically been an ally of Saudi Arabia. It's a bit of a complicated relationship because on the one hand, the US has been giving military assistance to Saudi Arabia and overlooking the obvious divergence in democratic values between the two countries. In exchange, it's had cooperation on oil. Now, in recent times, their relationship has been more problematic because Saudi Arabia has been cutting oil production in conjunction with Russia, thereby raising global crude oil prices that the US obviously finds very painful, being a large consumer of oil. There's also been a lot of criticism of Saudi Arabia in the US after the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi and the Saudi war in Yemen, where it is said to be using US military equipment. Meanwhile, US's major enemy in the region is also the enemy of Saudi Arabia and Israel, which is Iran, which gets us to the fifth point, Iran and its international dealings. Two factors that define the US-Iran relationship, and both are linked to each other: Iran's nuclear ambitions and Iran's oil. Now, Iran has the world's third largest crude oil reserves after Venezuela and Saudi Arabia, produces over 2 million barrels per day, and hence is one of the largest producers of crude oil in the world. Now, Iran has also been very interested in getting a nuclear bomb, and obviously Israel is really threatened by this. Now, this led to US sanctions against it, which basically made it very difficult for countries to trade with Iran on oil. But in 2015, under President Obama, Iran and the US agreed on a deal where Iran dismantles its program and the US brings down the sanctions. In 2018, however, President Trump withdrew from the agreement. Now, under President Biden, it is said that the two countries were again talking, and while a formal agreement hasn't been there seems to have been some understanding forming between them. Meanwhile, Iran still manages to find ways to bypass the sanctions. As you can see, Iran's crude oil exports have come down, but they still exported close to 1 million barrels per day in 2022. And there are reports that they're probably exporting more this year, China being one of their key customers. And by the way, it may seem to you that US would want Iran to stop having these oil revenues, but actually they also don't want to stop them. Because remember, Saudi Arabia, Russia, they've just cut their oil production for this year. Crude oil prices have been rising because of that. So the presence of Iranian oil in the market is actually helping cap prices. Because already the difference between oil demanded and oil supplied is estimated to be at decadal highs of around 3 million barrels per day in the October to December quarter. And for a lot of advanced economies, they're battling with high inflation. So the fact that this extra 1 million barrels per day is still in the market is actually of help to the US indirectly. Finally, the sixth point. Hamas is not the same as Palestine. A lot of Palestinians live in the West Bank that has an internationally recognized government, the Palestinian Authority. It's run by the Fatah party, and they engage with Israel much more constructively. Hamas, on the other hand, is a militant party in Palestine politics. It's the rival of Fatah. In fact, Hamas and Fatah have fought between each other, and now the status quo seems to be that Hamas governs the Gaza Strip while the Fatah government runs the West Bank. This is Mahmoud Abbas. He is the president of the state of Palestine. He has been very quiet since Hamas launched this attack. So not all Palestinians necessarily want this kind of confrontation with Israel that Hamas orchestrated. And just to make the point of how one is considered a terrorist organization and the other an internationally recognized government, the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken has met President Abbas sometime back to discuss the Israel issue. The US would never dream of doing this with a terrorist organization. And look, there's a lot that I have brushed over or oversimplified because frankly, the whole of the Middle East cannot be summarized in a few minutes, but this is like the cheat sheet of who wants what in the Middle East. In part 2 of this video, we talk about how this conflict can evolve, what are the different scenarios that can play out, and link to that how financial markets will react, how the global economy will react, and very importantly, how the Indian economy will react. As always, like, share, and subscribe to the Bond Economist.